Welcome to the Unlist. Today we're going to be discussing and talking a little bit about examples of British perfumery. Now I need to preface this with the fact that I am not British, but there are people who, when you talk about their country or things from their country, they take that protectionist, isolationist stance of you have no right to speak on my stuff because you're not born here like I am. And to that I always have to say, well, actually, we have media and internet and imports exist. So yeah, I can watch British television. I can listen to British artists. I can buy British food imported. And I can also make friends with British people on the internet, or some of them that move here have one-on-one conversations with. So it is quite possible to get acquainted with something from another country, even if you're not born there, let alone visiting there. No, you got to be born there to truly know. So it's silliness. But I just say this only to cover my bases, since I've had conversations on Base Notes and elsewhere where I talk about something French, right, or something Italian, and some French guy or Italian guy always gets up their own asshole about it and wants to have a fight with me. Like a literal, they wanna get into fisticuffs because I said something about whatever thing French, thing Italian, and it's goofy. So here I am making a video on British perfumery, and I'm probably going to get some English guy that's going to get really angry that the Yankee talked about his perfume. So I just want to throw it out there that yes, I can learn about your stuff without being your literal brother or next door neighbor. Again, it's a little weird to have that take, but I get it. People want to protect their stuff from outsiders. Protectionism, isolationism is kind of a sort of defense mechanism. I don't agree with it, but I understand, right? Now, anyway, British perfumery to me has always felt adjacent to French perfumery because there's been a lot of cultural exchange between France and the UK, whether it's via war or other things, diplomacy. I mean, going all the way back to Charlemagne, right? So it's adjacent to, but has its own flavor, really, its own unique flavor. And because French perfumery dominates the world, really, every department store, shopping mall, everywhere, from Japan all the way to, the United States and everything in between. You can buy Chanel anywhere. You can buy Dior just about anywhere. So French fragrances are kind of global fragrances now, right? Yeah, you can have more unique French flavors. You can smell, vintage Guerlains and Carons, Houbrigants, and get more of a unique French vibe from that stuff. But any designer fragrance these days is global upon inception. I mean, things like Bleu de Chanel, Dior Sauvage, they're made to sell to everybody. They're not made to have a uniquely French feel to them, really. And you can make the same argument with certain British brands that are very global as well. Burberry, right? Burberry stuff, for the most part, is designed for the whole world. It's not designed to be British. Some of the older ones, yeah. Some of the older ones, very much so. But currently, no, not really. But, unlike France, the British perfume scene is very kind of protective of itself, of its culture, and it doesn't over-export itself, doesn't overextend itself. So, you won't see Florist or G.O.F. Trumper or D.R. Harris in every department store everywhere in the world. You just won't. In fact, there are people who don't even know those brands exist because you can't find them unless you have certain specialty shops that go out of their way to import those products. You see, that's the key difference. It's not like they're not available. Florist is available globally, Penhaligon's is available globally, but they're not shoving it into every department store everywhere to make it a global thing. So a little bit of a distinction there. And the other thing that really makes British perfumery, in my mind's eye, unique and attractive is a certain penchant, if you will, which is French, but bear with me here. Certain penchant for, well, how else can I put this but austerity? Like, they are conservative, not in a political way, okay? We're not talking politics here, but British fragrances are by and large very conservative in their expression of style, okay? So they're not very loud, they're not very thick or rich, they're not very sweet or overly spicy, or have a whole lot of pop and sizzle to the top notes. They're not extroverted in any one particular area. They're very restrained, and they tend to prefer things that have drier citruses, more powdery or clean displays of florals. If they feature animalics, and some do, the animalics are usually melded in with the woods and the mosses to more or less base out and shape the rest of the composition. The animalics aren't there to just slap you like a bottle of Koros or even a vintage bottle of Jiki just kind of slaps you, right? With the big patchouli and the civet and the Jiki. And in Koros's case, it's the animalis base or big dollop of castoreum, right? Like you'll find in One Man Show. Those kind of fragrances, those are all French brands, right? The animalics, sometimes the animalics are part of a larger whole, like with Bala Versailles, part of a larger whole, not necessarily designed to shock you. But in other cases, they very much are designed to just hit you and make you pay attention. British fragrances don't really do that. They want to be just sort of this really, I'm going to quote a Netflix show here, so bear with me, but if you've seen Haunting of Bly Manor, there's a little girl in that show, and she always says, "perfectly splendid." And it's just the most, like, stereotypically British thing to say, right? Everything is just a place for everything and everything in its place, perfectly splendid, right? That's kind of what we're talking about here, is the perfumes are just balanced and constrained to the nth degree. And they do it in search of elegance. They do it in search of poise, to have grace and nobility, right? They don't want, anything hanging out and being garish and unsightly. And for that reason, British fragrances can feel old-fashioned even when they're not. Because it's a sign of modernity to have big, heavy, sweet, or musky accords, or super dynamic citrus, ozonic, aldehydic top notes. That kind of pizzazz and fire, nostril fireworks, right? That's a hallmark of modernity. You smell any modern fragrance, whether it's something like My Way from Emporio Armani, or Olympia by Paco Rabanne, or if we're talking men's stuff, right? Obviously, Invictus, again, Paco Rabanne, Dior Sauvage, all those fragrances, either really big, loud, really big, sweet. Even in the 50s and 60s, Chanel No. 5, massive aldehydes, right? So British fragrances try to avoid that. There are outliers, okay? There are definitely outliers. There are absolutely outliers. But it's that sort of austerity and cultural conservatism that really define a lot of classic British perfume brands. Now, again, indies can do what they want. You know, big mainstream brands that sell globally, like Burberry, like Dunhill, can do what they want because those brands are not concerned with maintaining a British identity as much as they are concerned with moving millions and millions and millions of bottles, right? Dunhill sold everywhere. Obviously, the other one I just named, Burberry, again, sells everywhere. So the other big unique thing about British fragrances is a lot of the classic British houses come primarily from grooming related services. So what I mean by that is French brands, okay, Guerlain, they were candle makers and soap makers. They made perfume sachets and things like that before they began tinkering with alcohol perfume and colognes. But, you know, Guerlain was always a perfume maker from the start. They never started in another industry that was adjacent and then move over into perfumery. They were perfumers from day one. Caron's the same way. Houbigant was the same way. Perfumer from day one. You look at the classic British brands, Floris was a barber and a comb maker. Penhaligon's, barber. G.O.F. Trumper, barber. Taylor of Old Bond Street, barber. True Fit and Hill, barber. D.R. Harris, apothecary, not a barber, apothecary, but sold grooming products because apothecaries do what? Make drugs. They make creams for the skin. They make topical stuff as well as pills. They make topical stuff. So, again, grooming. You get your Macassar, you get your eau de quinine, you get all kinds of things from the apothecary, right? You're shaving, your depilatory, yeah, that's a hard word to say. Your depilatory products come from a store like D.H. Harris or D.R. Harris. And thus, even though D.R. Harris was never a barber, they made barber supplies. Maybe a local barber in the area would buy their stuff from D.R. Harris. And then, thus, again, grooming. So a lot of British perfume brands were very much based on either people who did grooming for a living or sold products that were used for grooming, in D.R. Harris's particular case. And the Crown Perfumery, it's another one. Okay, William Thompson, I believe his name was. Another barber. So, although what's funny about him is the Crown Perfumery in particular, he got his claim to fame with smelling salts. Lavender laced smelling salts that people would use when they fainted, because you have to remember in the 19th century, in the Victorian era, women were stuffed into corsets. They were squishing their guts in. So they would pass out sometimes because they couldn't breathe. So then they would smell the lavender scented smelling salts from the Crown Perfumery, and then it wakes them back up. Hey, maybe I shouldn't squish my guts so tight, right? So that's a thing to consider. A lot of these barbers or druggists at the apothecaries would make these good smelling products, and then they would figure out, hey, maybe we should make fragrances that don't have a practical purpose. You just wear them because they smell good. And then if they move away from the aftershave tonics, the hair tonics, start making the standalone perfumes. And that's the difference. So a lot of these British products have a history that relates to a more practical use. In that way, British perfumery actually relates closely to American barbershop culture. Although in my previous video, I discussed American barbershop culture had an entirely different trajectory and everything. You know, American barbers don't really make perfumes. They just cut hair and use products that they purchase on their customers. But it's that same sort of, it needs a practical purpose. It needs to have an effect to it. That there's that link. It's a tenuous link, granted, but there's still a link there. Now, the other thing to consider too about British perfumery is that it doesn't operate in the same way as French brands. You know, a lot of French brands, they get their claim to fame by basically getting their stuff distributed in as many places as possible and getting their stuff as exposed with advertisements, with magazine ads in the old days before television, then radio ads, then TV ads, you know, commercials, marketing. Whereas another thing that's, I guess, culturally conservative in a way, maybe it's a part of austerity as well, is the idea of keeping the brands kind of exclusive. If you know, you know. So it's like a lot of the classic British perfume houses would operate on clout, the clout of their customers. You know, the well-heeled gentleman who's respected shops here, and he tells his select friends who are hopefully also well-heeled to come shop here too. Not every Tom, Dick, and Harry we want in our shop, okay? Because they're going to come in and window shop and not buy anything and just, you know, jerk around. So then the clientele list, you get the well-known people on the clientele list, whether it's celebrities, whether it's politicians, whether it's actual nobles, okay? But then the brands can trot out their ledgers and show, Sir this and Dame that and Prince this all bought stuff from us. You know, famous theatrical actor bought from us, and you build that clout that way. And the French brands did that initially. I mean, all the brands did that in the days before advertising, but the difference is the British brands stuck with that, whereas like the French brands really hopped on the modern advertising marketing train. You know, again, starting with the designers in the post-war era, just commercials, and it's like the British brands are just, no, if you know, you know. You're not going to see a television commercial in the 80s where florist is going to advertise a new fragrance. Then it moves to a Coke commercial, right? That's just didn't really happen. Now, you might hear on TV about a certain famous person who uses a florist product. Obviously, you know, Winston Churchill was a well-known person who used florists and Penhaligons, by the way. And, you know, that's, again, kind of building towards the whole idea of clout. And then royal warrants, obviously. A lot of the really illustrious products in the UK, the really respected products, carry royal warrants from somebody within the ruling family. 1, 2, 3. Collect them like Pokemon, but you see them on the bottles. I'll give you an example here. So, my bottle of Douro Eau de Portugal by Penhaligons. See the 2 little royal warrants right there. And the brands that don't get those don't get quite as respected as the brands that do. So, it's just the way it is. And with that whole thing, it just adds another layer, I guess you could say. I don't think GOF Trumper has any royal warrants. They may have at one point in time. I don't think they do now, though. But the thing about GF Trumper is they were always considered more of a middle class house anyway. They weren't like a Lord's. They were more of a House of Commons kind of brand, if you want to get into that whole thing. So that's why their products are less expensive than some of the others. Now that we've gotten that out of the way, in summary, British perfumery is going to feel more traditional, more conservative, more old-fashioned, because that's the aesthetic they've cultivated over the past several hundred years. And there are outliers, like I said. Every once in a while, you'll see a brand, will break out with something more modern smelling, a little more, I guess, capitulating to modern tastes. But they typically walk it back within a few years or discontinue it. I've seen all these brands trot out stuff that was very similar to what designers were doing. Penhaligon's has done it. Okay, they've all done it. But then the product comes out, confuses everyone, and then it gets discontinued. And then they just go right back to what they were already doing, what they've been doing. And, the other thing, too, is it's really hard for new, young British perfume brands to get established because everyone just keeps harping on the old names, not to beat a dead horse, but, again, Penhaligon's, GF Trumper, Floris, Raja Dove is a relatively young brand in this scene, and his brand in general is respected, probably respected a lot more with new money people, with the global market, more than it is locally within Great Britain, because people see it and see how expensive it is, and how a lot of his fragrances are riffing off of French designs and such, and it's just not, it's one of those things where someone that really, really values like the historical significance and the unique character of British perfumery is probably going to turn their nose a bit at Raja Dove stuff. But the person who wants to show how expensive their perfumes are, people that generally like to show off things like their Creed collection, their Royal Crown, and all these other super expensive brands, Fragrance du Bois, that kind of person will definitely flex their Raja Dove. But young brands like that have a hard time. And then, of course, there's Murdoch of London. They've only been around since 2010. And again, Murdoch of London is a mostly men's exclusive brand. And they try to really just sort of go in with the whole men's barbershop aesthetic. They're trying to really modernize what GF Trumper does, for the most part, make it more palatable to modern tastes. I have some of their fragrances and I enjoy them. Then you've got a lot of outliers too. You've got stuff like Alfred and Hoff, Ted Baker, Mark Burley was a flash in the pan, but they were around for a while making fragrances. And then Richard James of Savile Row, I've got one of his too. But yeah, it's a lot easier to be a new up-and-coming brand when you come from somewhere like, again, France, Italy, United States. But when you're doing British stuff, that tradition is so important. So it's like being new actually works against you. Being new is not in your favor, is what I'm saying. So that's a toughie right there. That's a toughie. Guess you could also consider Naughton and Wilson, right? Mr. Smelly's brand would technically be considered a British perfume brand, but most of his stuff does have some of that that flair, but it's a bit of a hybrid, you know. I kind of think with the perfumer he uses, John Stevens, and the kind of styles he goes after, I say his stuff is kind of straddling the line between British and French for the most part. So there you guys have it. British perfumery, love it or hate it. Now, I've spent a lot of this video really covering more of the scene itself and not really talking about my favorite British brand fragrances. I've only got maybe 7 minutes left, so I can do a quick fire, but I should probably do a separate video that talks about them more in depth. Obviously, I like my Penhaligons, and I've already explained I like my Murdochs too. Here's one of my Murdochs. One of my favorite ones actually is this one. This is a black tea. This is one of the, I mean, they're all good, but this is one of the better ones. And their vetiver is excellent. Their patchouli is excellent. But again, they have that dry, austere kind of penchant for keeping everything as constrained and measured and proportioned as possible. Their patchouli is not too thick or rich. Their vetiver is not too smoky, not too grassy. It's just complete measure through and through. Some of the outliers I have, like I said, that don't really fit the typical British theme. For example, like I mentioned Savile Row by Richard James, who is an actual tailor on Savile Row. Surprise, surprise, right? To the surprise of no one. But they put this fragrance out in 2003, and this is a very rich, creamy, musky, ambery, sort of tuberose-based spicy floral fragrance. And, I mean, it's not super spicy or super musky, so it does show a little bit of that classic British restraint, but it's a much thicker, richer kind of developing fragrance than you would really expect from a brand like this. So I consider it to be an outlier, and it's fantastic. So if you like spicy, rich stuff. And then, of course, Dunhill, the original 1934 Dunhill. This is a more recent bottle, though, but this is still older, but this is like 90s. This is like 90s older. So, and this stuff, woo, I mean, in this 1934 fragrance, you can kind of smell the future of most leather, chypre type fragrances that would be sold to men. I mean, Nietzsche 10 is older than this. Nietzsche 10 came out in like 24, I believe. This is exactly 10 years later, but this is kind of like Nietzsche 10 if you added lavender, if you added carnation, if you just made it a bit richer and more base heavy. Or Nietzsche 10 was more of a powdery fragrance. So like a more rustic kind of version of that. And then English leather would take this further by being even more about the oak moss and very bitter, sharp, bright fragrance. But this one does feel more British than the Savile Row does for sure, but it's also from 1934. And the general style of all men's fragrances, no matter where they were in the world, was kind of along these lines. I mean, 1934 is when Pour Un Homme first came out, when Caron first released Pour Un Homme. And that was a revolution when that hit the market. So again, you know, it's like history really informs why things smell the way they do and why they develop. As I was saying, most Burberry stuff is not particularly British in style because it's a very global brand. But occasionally they do something that feels more British. And I think no better example of that than actual Brit. Burberry Brit for Men. It's like they tried with this one. They actually tried. And they made a very sort of sharp, woody, powdery, very constrained floral fragrance. There's rose in this. There's cardamom in here. There's cedar wood and tonka. But it's not a gooey, rich, sweet tonka. It's a very dry tonka. So they kind of nailed the assignment with that one. But others that would have, like London, not really. The one from the 90s, not really. Touch a little bit. I mean, Touch has violet. You have to understand a lot of British fragrances also are very big on lime, gin accords like juniper berries. They like rose, especially very dry May rose. And of course, they like sharp woody things too. They like their musks to be very compressed, not very rich and soft. So once again, it's all about that sort of constrained elegance and measure and grace. Nothing hangs out. Nothing screams at you. And when other brands try to do that, like Creed has tried to do that a handful of times with stuff like Royal Water and Royal Mayfair, they put Royal in front of stuff when they're trying to be British, right? That's but, you know, Creed's a whole other thing. Florist, in particular, is the brand Creed wishes they were, because Creed claims all of these noble clients they have no evidence to back up. But Florist actually has the receipts. Florist can actually pull out a book and show you, yeah, you know, this person, Eva Peron, ordered this. You know, Winston Churchill ordered that. Princess Diana, this was her favorite. And they go right on down the list because they keep all the records. So, like, you know, at least there's that too. If you want a real version of Creed, then they have that. It's called Florist. Alright guys, this has been my crash course in British perfume. I am probably going to make some people really angry. Again, I spent 2 minutes prefacing that I don't really care. We have all sorts of ways we can learn about one another without hopping on a plane and going there, or again, being born there. So if you make an issue out of it, I'm just going to block you anyway. This is for everyone else with an open mind to watch. This has been the Unlist. Thanks for watching.